I never thought working as a night security guard would be anything complicated. To be honest, I didn't expect much from the job. I needed money fast, and the ad seemed simple enough. Night security guard wanted. Easy job, good pay. As soon as I saw it, I called right away. The manager, a guy named Mr. Harper, seemed desperate to fill the position. He didn't ask too many questions, just confirmed my availability and scheduled an interview for the same day. The mall was huge, but the atmosphere at night felt different. The windows, which were full of life during the day, now had this melancholic, almost oppressive tone. When I got to the security office, Mr. Harper was waiting for me with a tired, almost nervous look on his face. He handed me an ID badge and said, "All right, the job's pretty straightforward. You do regular patrols, check if the doors are locked, and make sure no one breaks into the building. But," he paused for way too long, "there are rules." He pulled a crumpled sheet of paper from his desk and handed it to me. I quickly skimmed through it. Rules for the night shift. 1. Don't stay in Corridor C for more than 5 minutes. 2. Never look into the mirrors between 3 o'clock and 3:15 a.m. 3. If you hear footsteps behind you, don't look back. 4. Ignore anyone asking for help by the emergency exits. 5. If the radio transmits static, say, "This place is safe." I looked at him, confused. "Are you serious?" I asked, holding back a laugh. "Very." He replied, "Dead serious. If you follow the rules, the shift will be smooth. If not, well, things could get complicated." That pause carried more than just hesitation. Mr. Harper seemed like he wanted to tell me something, but then backed off. Since I was desperate for money, I decided to overlook the weirdness. I thought it was probably some prank or just a way to scare the rookies. The shift started at 10 p.m. The security cameras were scattered all over the mall, showing empty corridors, dark stores, and still escalators. I did my first patrol around the mall, carrying a flashlight and trying not to think about the echo of my own footsteps. The first night was almost too calm, but deep down, something didn't feel right. The store windows reflected me strangely, like the reflection was just a bit slower than usual. And in Corridor C, I felt like I was being watched. When the clock hit 3 a.m., I remembered the rules. I stayed away from the mirrors and kept patrolling, but it was impossible to ignore the sounds. Footsteps coming from somewhere behind me, slowly but steadily. I took a deep breath and kept walking, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being followed only grew stronger. I forced myself not to look back, even as the footsteps seemed to be only a few meters away. When I returned to the security office at the end of the shift, I saw Mr. Harper waiting for me. He looked at me with a relieved expression. "You survived your first night. Welcome to the team." That was the moment I realized this wasn't a normal job. I never thought working as a night security guard would be anything complicated. To be honest, I didn't expect much from the job. I needed money fast, and the ad seemed simple enough. Night security guard wanted. Easy job, good pay. As soon as I saw it, I called right away. The manager, a guy named Mr. Harper, seemed desperate to fill the position. He didn't ask too many questions, just confirmed my availability, and scheduled an interview for the same day. The mall was huge, but the atmosphere at night felt different. The windows, which were full of life during the day, now had this melancholic, almost oppressive tone. When I got to the security office, Mr. Harper was waiting for me with a tired, almost nervous look on his face. He handed me an ID badge and said, "All right, the job's pretty straightforward. You do regular patrols, check if the doors are locked, and make sure no one breaks into the building. But he paused for way too long. There are rules. He pulled a crumpled sheet of paper from his desk and handed it to me. I quickly skimmed through it. Rules for the night shift. 1. Don't stay in corridor C for more than 5 minutes. 2. Never look into the mirrors between 3 o'clock and 3:15 a.m. 3. If you hear footsteps behind you, don't look back. 4. Ignore anyone asking for help by the emergency exits. 5. If the radio transmits static, say, "This place is safe." I looked at him, confused. "Are you serious?" I asked, holding back a laugh. "Very." He replied, "Dead serious. If you follow the rules, the shift will be smooth. If not, well, things could get complicated." That pause carried more than just hesitation. Mr. Harper seemed like he wanted to tell me something, but then backed off. Since I was desperate for money, I decided to overlook the weirdness. I thought it was probably some prank or just a way to scare the rookies. The shift started at 10 p.m. The security cameras were scattered all over the mall, showing empty corridors, dark stores, and still escalators. I did my first patrol around the mall, carrying a flashlight and trying not to think about the echo of my own footsteps. The first night was almost too calm, but deep down, something didn't feel right. The store windows reflected me strangely, as if the reflection was just a bit slower. And in corridor C, I felt like I was being watched. When the clock hit 3 a.m., I remembered the rules. I stayed away from the mirrors and kept patrolling, but it was impossible to ignore the sounds. Footsteps, coming from somewhere behind me, slowly but steadily. I took a deep breath and kept walking, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being followed only grew stronger. I forced myself not to look back, even as the footsteps seemed to be only a few meters away. When I returned to the security office at the end of the shift, I saw Mr. Harper waiting for me. He looked at me with a relieved expression. "You survived your first night. Welcome to the team." That was the moment I realized this wasn't a normal job. On my third shift, one thing became clear. I wasn't prepared for what awaited me in that mall. I spent the whole day thinking about the mannequin, the distorted reflection, and Mr. Harper's words. "Things are going to get worse," he said. And he was right. I arrived at 9:45 p.m. as usual, but this time the mall felt different. The darkness seemed thicker. The sounds echoed in a strange way, and there was a faint smell of metal in the air like blood. "You need to be extra careful tonight, more than ever," Mr. Harper said as soon as I entered the security office. He handed me another sheet of paper with additional rules. Additional rules. 1. If the lights flicker, stay still until they stabilize. 2. If you see anything move in corridor C, leave immediately. 3. At 4 a.m., turn off the cameras in corridor C for exactly 60 seconds. I was about to ask why these new rules, but Harper looked exhausted and wasn't in the mood to explain. He just shook his head and left, leaving me alone with the screens and the oppressive silence. When the shift started, I was already on edge. I forced myself to follow the patrol routine, walking through the corridors lit only by the light from my flashlight. The echo of my footsteps seemed amplified, like someone else was walking with me. At midnight, while checking the corridors, something caught my attention in corridor C. It wasn't the mannequin this time, but a long shadow that seemed to have no owner. It moved, slithering along the walls as if it were liquid. My heart raced, but I followed the rule. I didn't enter the hallway. I kept a safe distance, watching. The shadow began to move closer to the entrance, and that's when I noticed it had a vaguely human shape, like someone, but not fully solid. The radio in my pocket crackled with static, making me jump. I immediately recited the phrase, "This place is safe." The static stopped, but when I looked back, the shadow was gone. Around 3 a.m., something strange happened. The lights in corridor C started flickering rapidly, illuminating the area in quick flashes. I remembered the rule. If the lights flicker, stay still. But when I did that, I noticed something terrifying. The shadow was at the end of the hallway, staring directly at me. Even without a face, I knew I was being watched. I blinked instinctively, and it was closer. I swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. The lights kept flickering, and with each blink, the shadow seemed to move forward a few steps. When it was only a few feet away, the light stabilized. I looked again, and the hallway was empty. At 4 a.m., I returned to the security office and turned off the cameras in Corridor C for exactly 60 seconds, as instructed. Those were the longest 60 seconds of my life. When I turned the cameras back on, the hallway was completely dark. A message appeared on the monitor screen, typed on its own. "You're seeing what you shouldn't." My breath grew heavy, and my instinct told me to leave immediately. But something inside me wanted answers. On my last patrol of the night, I heard a faint sound coming from one of the stores. A child's laugh. My blood ran cold. I decided to ignore it and follow the rules, but as I walked, I noticed small, wet footprints on the floor, leading directly into Corridor C. As soon as the shift ended, I ran to the security office, where Harper was waiting for me. He looked at me as if he already knew what had happened. "They're closing in on you. This is dangerous." "Who are they?" I asked, trying to control my panic. "Those who haunt the corridor. They like those who break the rules." I knew he was telling the truth, but the question that haunted me was, what would happen if I broke the rules on purpose? By my fourth shift, fear had turned into paranoia. I knew there was something in the mall, something Harper never fully explained. It wasn't just superstition or some story to scare people. It was real, and it was getting bolder. I spent the day going over the rules again, trying to understand what each one meant. Why turn off the cameras? Why avoid looking behind you when you hear footsteps? Everything pointed to something moving through the shadows, something that responded to our presence. When I showed up for my shift, Harper was waiting for me with a grim look on his face. He looked like he'd aged years in just a few days. "You need to understand something," he started, before I could say anything. "These rules aren't random. Every single one of them was written with blood, sweat, and the fear of those who came before you." He paused, looking at the cameras for a moment before continuing. "This mall was built on top of something old, something that should never have been disturbed. They say that during construction, they found a series of tunnels and caves beneath the building. But instead of stopping, they sealed it all up and kept going. That's when the problems started." "What kind of problems?" I asked, my voice trembling. He sighed. "People disappearing, objects moving on their own, and the shadows, always the shadows." He stopped, like he was carefully choosing his next words. "These rules are the only thing keeping us alive. Each one is a barrier, a silent pact we made to coexist with what's here." I stayed quiet, trying to process what he had said. Whatever was in that place, it seemed way older and more dangerous than I'd imagined. At midnight, things started happening again. First, the silence. It was so deep that even my own footsteps sounded muffled. Then the lights began flickering, but this time, it was happening in more than one corridor. I looked at the cameras and my stomach twisted. The shadows were everywhere. Some moved slowly, while others seemed to slide along the walls and display windows, like predators lying in wait. Suddenly, the radio crackled. "They're testing you." The voice was Harper's, but something about it sounded different. It was dragged out, almost like an echo. "Harper, are you there?" I asked, gripping the radio tightly. There was no response. I continued my patrol, trying to ignore the growing discomfort. When I passed by Corridor C, I felt the air change again. It was colder, and there was a strange smell, something between wet earth and metal. Then I heard a sound that froze me, the laugh of a child coming from Corridor C. I remembered the rules. Don't go into Corridor C between midnight and 3 a.m., but something about that laugh was hypnotic. Before I could stop myself, My feet started moving. When I reached the corridor, I saw something that made me question my sanity. The display windows were covered in small handprints, like dozens of children had passed through there. In the middle of the corridor, the mannequin was back, but now it had its head turned directly toward me. "Who's there?" My voice came out shaky. The response came in a way I didn't expect. The mannequin tilted its head to the side, like it was studying me, and then it took a step forward. I ran. My heart was pounding as I heard footsteps behind me, footsteps that weren't mine. The rules echoed in my mind. Don't look back. I made it to the security room, slammed the door shut, and stared at the monitors. Corridor C was empty again, but the radio started crackling. This time, an unfamiliar voice emerged from the static. "Why don't you follow the rules?" My skin crawled. The voice wasn't human. It was deep, distorted, and seemed to come from all directions. Then, the camera in Corridor C began to show something that didn't make sense. It was a view of the mall, but not like I knew it. The stores were empty, the windows shattered, and the shadows roamed freely. I was looking at a reflection of what could happen if the rules were completely ignored. At 6 a.m., Harper entered the room, but this time, he was different. His eyes looked deeper, his expression darker. He placed a hand on my shoulder and said only one sentence. "You've seen more than you should." I knew he was right, and I knew that from that moment on, things were only going to get worse. After that night, I knew I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. Something in that mall was alive, aware, and its intentions were not good. The rules weren't just precautions. They were barriers keeping the chaos contained. That morning, as Harper finished his shift, he stopped at the door before leaving and gave me a look that seemed like a silent warning. Something told me he knew more than he was willing to reveal. The day dragged on. I tried to sleep, but the images of the mannequin moving in the shadows in Corridor C haunted me. When night fell, I returned to the mall with a feeling like I was walking straight into a trap. As soon as I entered the security room, I found an envelope on the desk. It was marked only with my name, written in shaky handwriting. Inside, there was a yellowed piece of paper with a message that seemed like an addendum to the rules. 1. Never speak to the voices, even if they sound familiar. 2. If the larger shadow appears, turn off all the lights and close your eyes. 3. At 2:37 a.m., leave the security room, no matter what you see on the cameras. My fingers trembled as I held the paper. These instructions weren't in Harper's manual. Who had left them there? And why should I trust them? At midnight, things started happening earlier than usual. The lights flickered erratically, and the radio emitted static noise accompanied by indistinct whispers. When I looked at the cameras, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a dark spot in the center of the food court. The spot seemed to grow, absorbing the light around it. My heart raced. It was a palpable presence, an emptiness that seemed to pulse like a beating heart. At 2:10 a.m., the voices began. They came from all directions, whispering my name, asking for help, begging me to listen. Some sounded like co-workers who had worked there before. Others had familiar tones, like friends or relatives. "Please help me," a soft voice called. It was my mother's voice. I closed my eyes and covered my ears, but the voices wouldn't stop. They grew louder, each one more desperate than the last. Then, through the radio, I heard Harper. "Don't listen. Don't respond." When I opened my eyes, the dark spot in the food court had transformed. Now, it was a gigantic figure, a tall and distorted shadow that seemed to fill the entire space. Its presence was suffocating, as if all the air in the mall was being drained. My eyes fixed on the clock. 2:37. The cameras were showing impossible things. Corridors that didn't exist, people walking through abandoned areas, and figures that seemed to look directly into the lenses, as if they knew I was watching. The paper with the instructions trembled in my hand. I had to leave the security room, but every fiber of my body screamed to stay where I was. Finally, I gathered my courage and opened the door. The corridors were darker than ever, and the lights flickered endlessly. As I walked, I felt something following me, something that never made a sound, but whose presence was unmistakable. I reached a food court and saw the dark figure up close. It had no eyes, but I knew it was watching me. Its form flowed like smoke, and its extremities seemed to stretch into tentacles that touched everything around it. Suddenly, it turned, slow and deliberate, as if inviting me to follow it. "You don't belong here." Yet a guttural voice echoed, not from outside, but within my mind. I began to retreat, but something stopped me. A dark portal started to open on the ground, and the shadows around me began to be sucked into it. My instinct told me to run, but my feet were glued to the floor. At the last second, I heard Harper's voice, this time clear and authoritative. "Run now." I obeyed, running back to the security room, feeling the ground tremble beneath my feet. When I shut the door behind me, the radio emitted one final sound, a deep, slow laugh. The shadow had disappeared, but I knew that wasn't the end. Something greater was coming, and I had been chosen to face it. The next morning, I couldn't sleep. The image of the giant shadow was still burned in my mind, and the voices that had called me seemed to echo in the corners of my consciousness. Something inside me told me that I needed answers. When I arrived for my shift, Harper was already waiting for me, something that never happened. He was holding an old, worn folder, with a serious look that made me feel like the ground was opening beneath my feet. "We need to talk." His voice was heavy, as if each word was a sentence. We sat in the security room, and he opened the folder, revealing yellowed pages, newspaper clippings, and faded photographs. "This shouldn't be here," he began, pointing to the dark figure in one of the photos. "But it is." The images showed the mall before its opening. In some, workers were posing for construction photos, but in others, there was something strange. Blurred shapes and dark spots in the background, as if something was watching. Harper explained that the land where the mall was built had a dark history. Years earlier, it had been the site of an industrial complex where many workers had died in suspicious accidents. There had been reports of voices, shadows, and disappearances. The company knew, but ignored it. They built the mall over everything, thinking they could just erase the history. He paused, taking a deep breath. But it wasn't buried. He showed me a map of the mall, and I noticed something I had never seen before, a restricted area marked as Sublevel 3. It was a floor beneath the parking garage, something never mentioned in the rules or training. "No one goes down there," Harper said, looking me directly in the eyes. Not even me. The rules began to make sense. They weren't just random instructions, but attempts to contain something that was alive in that place. Harper handed me one last newspaper clipping. It was from 1987, with the headline, "Security Guard Disappears in Mall During Night Shift." "This happened before I started here," Harper said. "The guy working the shift? He broke the rules." My mind was in chaos. Every piece of information seemed to push me deeper into the abyss. I wanted to leave, quit my job, and never look back, but part of me knew that wouldn't solve anything. The mall wasn't just a building. It was a predator. And now I was part of the game. Harper seemed to know what I was thinking. "You can leave now," he said, as if reading my mind. "But if you stay, you'll find out what's really going on." I looked at him, trying to gauge his words. He looked tired, as though he had carried this burden for far too long. "Why are you still here, Harper?" I asked. He laughed bitterly. "Because someone has to be." That night, I made my decision. I needed to know the truth. I grabbed the key Harper had given me and went down to Sublevel 3, my heart pounding so loudly it felt like it was echoing through the halls. The elevator descended slowly, and when the doors opened, I was greeted by a cold and damp corridor. The lights flickered intermittently, and there were strange marks on the walls, as if something had scratched the concrete. I walked toward a door at the end of the hallway, marked with a symbol I didn't recognize. When I opened it, I found myself in a vast room filled with old equipment, files, and objects that didn't belong to the present. In the center of the room, there was a large opening in the floor, surrounded by symbols carved into the concrete. It was from there that the shadow came. Before I could move, the voices started again, louder and more desperate than ever. They weren't just calling me anymore. They were accusing me, blaming me for something I didn't understand. Then, I saw it again, the larger shadow, rising from the hole in the ground, as if it were part of the mall itself. This time, it had a more defined shape, almost human, but not quite. You opened the door, the guttural voice echoed through the room. Now there's no turning back. I felt the ground tremble as the shadow drew closer, and the door behind me closed by itself. Whatever was in sublevel 3 wanted me to stay. I had crossed a point of no return. The environment around me seemed to disintegrate. The room began to distort, the walls stretching as if time and space were being torn apart. The shadow in front of me pulsated, almost as if it were breathing, and I could feel a growing pressure, as if something were crawling behind me, watching every movement. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was as if the air itself was holding me in place. I looked at the door I had entered through, but now it was covered by a thick layer of darkness, a mist that formed quickly, as if everything was made of shadows. I was trapped, unable to escape. It's no use trying. The hissing voice echoed again. This time, it came from inside my mind. I could hear its words as if it were within me. You made the choice. Now, you'll be part of us. Despair took over me. I wanted to scream, but my voice was lost in the darkness. I remembered the rules Harper had told me. Never look down. Never enter sublevel 3 alone. And one last rule he hadn't mentioned, but that I felt in every fiber of my being. Never, ever, challenge what has already been awakened. The shadow advanced, a dark and distorted mass that seemed to consume everything around it. I tried to resist, but something was drawing me toward it. My vision became blurry, and a cold chill ran through my body. I began to see distorted images, flashes of past moments, faces of people I had never known, but who somehow felt familiar. And then, amidst the darkness, I realized something horrifying. I was no longer alone. The voices were returning. At first, they were soft whispers, almost imperceptible. But soon, they began to grow, forming a deafening chorus of screams and wails. I looked around, trying to locate the source of the sounds, but all I could see was more darkness. That's when I realized I wasn't seeing shadows. I was seeing souls. Souls trapped in that place, just like me. People who had tried to escape, but were absorbed by the force that inhabited the mall. I could see their eyes, desperate, pleading for help that would never come. They were in every corner, their silhouettes writhing in agony. You can escape, one of the voices said, with a tone as desperate as mine. It never ends. We're all trapped. Before I could respond, something moved quickly to my left. It was a human figure, but its movements were wrong, as if it were a puppet being controlled by something invisible. It approached me, its empty eyes watching me. It was one of the security guards who had worked the ship before me. I knew this because I recognized his uniform. But he was changed. His skin was pale and rotting, his bones distorted in impossible ways. He raised a hand, pointing at me with a skeletal finger. "Don't fight the inevitable," he whispered. In that moment, I knew he was right. No matter how hard I tried, there was no way out. The mall had swallowed me just like it had swallowed everyone before me. I was lost, like a puppet being controlled by the dark force that resided in the depths of that place. And then, as the darkness enveloped me completely, one last hissing sentence echoed in my mind. "You are now one of us.